Hey there, welcome to Transform Your Workplace. This is a show where we give busy leaders and HR professionals the ideas, tools, and inspiration to build workplaces that people love. I'm Brandon Laws, and each week we unpack real world strategies you can use right away to create healthier cultures, spark growth, and yes, transform your workplace. Today's episode is brought to you by Xenium HR. If the endless demands of HR and payroll are eating up your day, Xenium's complete HR plus payroll solution unites everything under one roof: HR management, payroll administration, and even optional benefits support, so you can focus on what you do best, growing your business. In just a moment, you'll hear my conversation with Rob Shallenberger. He's a former fighter pilot, leadership coach, and author of the brand new second edition of Do What Matters Most: Lead a Life by Design, Not by Default. Rob's research-backed system promises a 30 to 50% jump in personal productivity without sacrificing well-being, 800 to 1,000 extra quadrant 2 priorities tackled each year. Think date nights, crucial client one-on-ones, or that health check you've been postponing. A dead simple 4-step pre-week planning routine that pulls stress out of your schedule and replaces it with clarity, and a fresh take on the Eisenhower Matrix, a rubber band style growth mindset, and small habits that reinforce purpose, performance, and importantly, longevity. If you lead people who are drowning in tasks, or you personally feel stretched thinner than ever, the next 40 minutes are going to be a game changer. Rob and I dig into how to craft a personal vision that doesn't have to change the world, just your world, and we translate it into weekly execution your whole team can rally around. So grab your notebook or open up the Notes app, because you're about to walk away with actionable steps that you can apply before the week is out. All right, let's dive in. Here's my conversation with Rob Shallenberger. Rob, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Looking forward to this conversation together.
You're out with the second edition of your book. It's called Do What Matters Most: Lead a Life by Design, Not by Default. And I love that. We're going to take life into our own hands by some of these simple steps that you have in the book. And I want to just dive right in. Your book promises 30 to 50% increase in productivity. And I want to start by what inspired you to write this book in the first place? But also, why do you believe that people can achieve that level of productivity just by following some of these steps?
Yeah, easy answer. So first of all, I hope people will get a copy of Do What Matters Most, either read it or listen to an audiobook, because it's one of those things that's life-changing. And I say that at the beginning of every training. And, you can see the skeptics and people like, yeah, right, and rightly so, because there's so much stuff and noise out there. But I invite people to say at the end of our training, you take me up on that, let me ask you. And without fail, 98% of the time when I ask someone at the end who feels like that was life-changing, the hands go up. And I mean, 98% of hands will go up. And that's the research, is that this is new for 98% of people. And so how this came about is, in a very nutshell version, is we've been training organizations all over the world on leadership and planning, productivity. Well, that was another training that we did, what's called the 12 Principles of Highly Successful Leaders, for several years. And the time management piece of that training was one that really resonated deeply with people. And they're like, can we do something specific to that? And that's when, about 12 years ago, we knew that there was its own separate training. So we then spent thousands of hours researching time management and terms that we've all heard our whole lives: vision, goals, weekly planning. And from that, we've developed a program or a system that we call Do What Matters Most. And now there's hundreds of organizations around the world using it. And it is indeed life-changing. And I invite anyone to test that statement by reading it and then applying the habits and see what impact it has on your life. And part two to your question is the 30 to 50%. And let me answer that in a slightly different way, Brandon, because numbers are just numbers and they don't really resonate with us personally. But here's a way to make that more personal. A person that does pre-week planning in the context of their vision and goals as outlined in Do What Matters Most will accomplish between 800 to 1,000 additional priorities each year with measurably less stress. And again, those are just numbers. But what if those are date nights? What if that translates into a one-on-one with a client or a team member and getting to know their story? Or what if that's the important health checkup that we've been postponing or procrastinating, or exercise, and the many other things that we could note? So that's huge. That's 800 to 1,000 additional priorities, all with measurably less stress. by applying these habits.
I love that because I think naturally a lot of people want to do as much as they possibly can. We always hear the phrase like do more with less. And a lot of times stress and burnout comes with that. So I think what you're saying is like in a way, like if we take the right steps, we build the right habits, then we're going to do all that and we're going to be happier and healthier while we're doing it.
Yeah, and the essence is exactly right on, Brandon. The essence is do what matters most. In other words, I hear all the time people say, I found so much time in my schedule I didn't even know I had. So we can't look at it through the same lens by which we're looking at it today, because when a person develops a written vision for each of their key roles in life, 1 to 4 specific goals for this year for each role, and then the key is in pre-week planning. It's the third of the 3 habits that we identify and do what matters most. It's the one upon which the entire program is really built, because that's the doing, it's the execution. And it's amazing how often we have this time that we don't even know we have. It's just that we've been focusing on the wrong things many times. And that's not really something we notice until we start focusing on the right things.
Yeah. Listeners know I love pulling out quotes from the book. This one is not from you, however, but it's a favorite quote that I found. It's attributed to St. Jerome. It says, good, better, best. Never let it rest till your good is better and your better is best. How does this mantra apply to the mindset that we all might have, and then possibly take an honest look at ourselves and what we're doing?
Yeah. And this is not an invitation for perfection. It's just to say, what does a growth mindset look like? How can we become a slightly better version of ourselves tomorrow than we are today? And by better, I mean having more fulfilled relationships, showing up and having a more positive influence and impact in the workplace, taking care of ourselves in a better and more positive way so that, emotionally we feel strong and secure. That's what I'm talking about. And so good, better, best, never let it rest till the good is better and the better is best, in that journey. That's what I like to use as the word journey, that this life is a journey and it's these incremental improvements every day.
Yeah. And you talk a lot about growth mindset, and you talked about how a rubber band is analogous to that growth mindset. Explain to listeners what you mean by that.
Yeah. A rubber band, if it sits in a drawer, is going to get stale. And ultimately, it won't be able to stretch anymore. It loses its flexibility. We as humans are not designed to be stale and just sit here. We're designed to be stretched. And the growth oftentimes happens in the stretch. That's why I invite people to apply the habits and just test them and see what happens after doing pre-week planning, as we're describing in Do What Matters Most, for 4 weeks. Test it for 4 weeks and watch the amazing stretch that happens. And I'm not talking like an uncomfortable stretch. I'm talking like, wow, that was an awesome month. I can't believe all the cool things that I was able to accomplish that I would have never thought I could have done.
Yeah. Yeah. Make it real for me. Like with the growth mindset and even just like stepping out of our comfort zone, like the stretching the rubber band once in a while, what does that look like? And maybe as an example, what's something that you've been wanting to do that maybe you need to stretch yourself?
Yeah. So I'm going to run a half marathon in Moab, Utah this year. It's out in the desert of Moab. And that's going to be a little stretch for me. I'm 50 years old this year. And for some people, that's easy. But for me, that's going to be a stretch. But it's going to be awesome. I'm going to do it with my son, who's 23 years old. And for him, cakewalk. He can run a half marathon with his eyes closed. Not me. For me, it's going to be a big stretch. Here's what I mean by that, Brandon, the growth mindset. When we do a training with someone or a keynote or whatever, I'll ask people to raise their hands as high as they can above their head. And everyone will raise their hands about halfway. Nobody ever raises them as high as they truly can. So I'll go a little higher. Get up on your tippy toes. Give me your absolute very best. Stretch as high as you can. And it's on the second or third time that people are up on their tippy toes. What's interesting about human psychology is one of the greatest hindrances to our growth, and that's why we liken the rubber band analogy. One of the greatest hindrances to our growth is comfort and complacency. And as a former fighter pilot, those were 2 very dangerous things to have happen in the cockpit. We'd get a little too comfortable, a little too complacent, and we're not checking the things that we should be checking. And I know that I almost died twice because of being a little too complacent in the cockpit. And it's very easy in life to get into that same place. And so that's what we talk about when we mean the growth mindset or the rubber band. And that's the mindset piece of the equation. It's the vision, goals, and pre-week planning that is the skill set piece of the equation. And both are important.
In the book, you outline some predictors of longevity so that we could hopefully be around and have a high quality life. What are some of those predictors that you've seen?
Yeah, and I can't remember if that's in chapter 3 or chapter 4.
Chapter 2, I believe.
And that's specific to the second edition of the book.
Okay. Yeah.
And the reason those are so important is because one thing we invite people to do is take this assessment of themselves in the circle of peace and balance. Where are they at today? And this is a very simple subjective and objective assessment. And the whole key in doing this is that we are a sum of our individual roles. It's not just one thing that's going to improve dramatically our lives. It's a sum of each of these key areas of our lives: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, relationships, feeling productive in the workplace and valued, etc. And so that's why this circle of peace and balance is so key. And these habits touch on every one of those. Now to your predictors of longevity question. I don't know if most people are aware of this, but the number one predictor of longevity, hands down, are relationships. A full book written on this, and Harvard did a study. It's why COVID was so difficult for so many people, because we forced separation against something that's not in our human nature. We crave relationships. And so that's the number one predictor of longevity. And then you have others like having a purpose, and some of the more obvious ones that we could all list off: diet, sleep, exercise, etc. I think all of us acknowledge that those are important in our lives, but the whole point is, how often do those become a priority? And for most people in our research, 68% of people feel like prioritizing their time is their number one challenge. 80% of people don't have a process to do it outside of sticky notes and to-do lists. And so while those predictors of longevity are important, and we would all acknowledge they are, for most people, those get pushed off to the side, or at least some of them do, in exchange for other things in our lives. And so that's why we bring those up in the book.
You highlight kind of an astounding stat. It's saying that someone with a significant personal issue is about 40% less productive at work. And I know for a lot of the leaders that I've talked to, at one point or another, they're having an employee with going through a big struggle at home. Everybody's going through something, right? What advice do you have for leaders who might be in that situation where they've got an employee really going through something? How do we help them get back on track?
I don't want to sound cliche, but I'm truly recommending that you have them redo what matters most, because it's right there in our research. 68% feel like prioritizing their time is the number one challenge. 80% don't have a process. What that's telling us, Brandon, and why this is so important, and for those listening to this, think about the people that you surround yourself with, coworkers, family members. For most people, that is the challenge, is they acknowledge that there's this weight on their shoulders that we've all experienced. How do we take that weight off our shoulders? How do we get back above water where we can breathe? And that's what most people are struggling with, is how to do it. The sticky notes, the to-do lists are not doing it. And so my really simple answer to that, and now there would be others if there was, context specific, but number one in all of my answers would be teach this person how to do pre-week planning as outlined in the 2 chapters of the book, because that single habit alone will transform someone's life. It will transform the way that they lead their life. You use that term, we'll either lead a life by design or live a life by default, right? And it's very safe to assume, if you're listening to this, don't you think so? That it would be safe to assume that all of us are going through a challenge that the people around us probably don't know anything about. And yet we're still being asked to perform at a high level within our organizations. So how do you juggle it all? How do you still navigate these things in our personal lives while showing up and performing at a high level? And pre-week planning is the answer to that. And pre-week planning is 10 times more powerful when it's done in context of our vision and our goals. Habits 1, 2, and 3 all brought together.
We'll get into the pre-week planning in a little bit, but I wanted to cover something that I see a lot of people struggle with, both at the individual level and personal or at work, is prioritization. And in the book, you outlined the Eisenhower matrix and kind of made it into your own for do what matters most. But I even love the analogy that you created with the aquarium analogy. And I've seen this in other forms too, but maybe just talk listeners through that and what it means in terms of prioritization.
Yeah, so the Do What Matters Most matrix we credit Eisenhower for developing the original one. It's called the Eisenhower matrix. People have probably seen a variation of it. When I ask people to raise their hands, usually 50% of people are familiar with that. And all we're doing is identifying these 4 quadrants. And if you're not familiar with it, you can certainly read this in the book. Quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the whole point is, if we're in any other quadrant besides 2, then our lives are probably pretty high stress. We probably are not very happy. We're probably losing peace. And so it's once again back to the question you just asked, Brandon, which is, how do we get to quadrant 2? If you're an HR manager or whoever, and you're sitting there talking with someone in front of you and they're struggling, how do you get them to a place where they can get on top of it? They've got to have a way to do it. And that's what so many people are missing. So in the Do What Matters Most matrix, all we're doing is trying to say, you know what, here's an awareness of 4 quadrants. Where are you and your team at right now? Where do you spend most of your time in? And now at least you have a conversational tool by which you can have conversations. Hey, I've got a quadrant 1 issue that I need to deal with. Okay, great. And I'll leave it at that for now, because that's a whole separate discussion in the book. But the whole point of that is, again, how do we get to quadrant 2 where we're at peace, where we are feeling fulfilled, where we're not feeling weighed down by all the things on our shoulders? So that's why we introduced the matrix at the beginning of the book. And the whole focus of the rest of the book is, great, how do we get there?
Yeah. You stated a pretty powerful statement, and it made me kind of self-check myself. But you said your personal vision doesn't have to change the world; it just has to change your world. Maybe elaborate on the power of having a personal vision and guiding somebody's daily decision making and actions. I know for me that struck a chord because I don't have a stated personal vision, and I know if I did, it probably would change the way I look at my daily habits. So maybe just talk me through that.
Yeah, Brandon, I love your questions. You ask such great questions. So let me back up even a little bit further. Do What Matters Most, this book and this program is all about pre-week planning. But as we've already talked about just briefly, how much more effective and powerful is pre-week planning when it's done in the context of our vision and our goals? Now, let me take one more step back because you said you don't have one, and you know what? Most people don't. We did the research on this. Only 2% of people have a written personal vision. So for as much as it's talked about, there's a big gap and it's not being done. And there are several reasons why that's the case. We break through all of those in the book. And what we invite people to do is identify the 5 to 7 roles that matter most in your life. So if you're listening to this right now, I'd invite you to think about what are the 5 to 7 roles that matter most to you. Personal is the most important role of those. We've got to take care of ourselves. In other words, we can't show up at work or in any of our other roles if we're not taking care of ourselves first. We can't draw water from an empty well. And so when you talk about a personal vision, if you're listening to this, imagine how powerful it would be to have a written personal vision for each of our key roles. So if you're a parent, a father, or a mother, what is your vision for that particular role? Who are we becoming? And you're exactly right, Brandon. Our expectation from the vision is not to be Mahatma Gandhi. It doesn't have to change the world. The whole purpose behind this is our personal vision only has to change our world. As a parent, as a spouse, as an HR leader, as a sales rep, as a brother or sister, son or daughter, whatever the roles are that you come up with, what is your vision for that role? Because it doesn't have to change the world. It just has to change your world and my world.
I love that. What are some common mistakes that people make in crafting their own personal vision?
Yeah, good question. Easy answer. Perfection. They're striving for perfection.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be perfect. Just come up with something. Something is better than nothing. And 98% of people don't have anything. And so something is better than nothing, even if it's not perfect. There's only 2 questions that I invite people to answer. And if they can answer yes to these, you've got it. It doesn't have to be perfect. Does it give you direction? And is it meaningful? If it gives you direction and it's meaningful, you've got it. Now, I invite people, and when you read the book, you'll see this. The way you do write your vision matters even more so in the goals. We want to use positive words. I will, I strive, I am, I choose. We want to state it in an aspirational way, what we do want, who we are becoming, not what we don't want. So we wouldn't say be less depressed. That's what we don't want, right? I strive to be a kind and caring husband who supports Tanya and helps her feel like a 10. I'm totally faithful in thought and action. And I constantly strive to compliment her, serve her, and be the husband of her dreams. It's not a goal, but that's who I'm becoming in the role of husband. And so that's a part of the answer. At least don't worry about perfection. Get started. And you're already doing what most people haven't done.
Have you ever seen organizations do this as a team, like having teams create their own personal visions? And then the chapter 6 and 7, you talk about the roles and goals. And I'm wondering if you as a team could craft personal visions and how it fits in with the team, and then look at the roles and goals and really try to figure out who's playing what role and how we're going to achieve this. Maybe walk me through how a team might do that.
Yeah, you could, but that's not how we approach it, Brandon. It's a great thought, and I'm not against it in any way. It would be great. That's just not how we approach it. So can I answer this in 2 different ways, how we do approach it, and then maybe a variation on what you're talking about? And if I can't remember your question, you can remind me.
Yeah.
Do What Matters Most, we approach from an organizational perspective. In other words, when we do the training in the book, you'll see that we invite people to start holding a weekly alignment meeting at the beginning of the week. That gets the team all synced up on what matters most as a team. Most teams don't do that right now in our own research. Now imagine what's the impact of every member of that team coming to the weekly alignment meeting, having already done their pre-week planning by role to identify what matters most this week, quadrant 2, to use the matrix analogy. What impact would that have? What kind of alignment would that create within a team, especially if they did that consistently? It wasn't a flavor of the month. And we're going to take a spin on the quote that we already used. We either have a culture by design or we'll have a culture by default. And so we've got to be very intentional about our culture. And this weekly alignment meeting and pre-week planning are one of the keys. Now, backing up, most of the training is focused on the individual. And so that's why we have a person take the circle of peace and balance. Then they identify the 5 to 7 roles that matter most to them. Usually there's 2 or 3 of those that are, different parts of their professional roles. Once they come up with a vision for each one, then you're exactly right. They'll come up with what are 1 to 4 specific measurable goals that are worded the correct way that would really move the needle for them in each of their respective roles this year. And so professionally, they'll usually have a couple of those roles. Now, when we're doing this in a team dynamic, we'll oftentimes have people share their vision and their goals with each other. And people love hearing other people's visions and goals because they're like, I hadn't even thought of it in that lens before. I've never looked at it through that lens. But I will say most of Do What Matters Most is focused first on the individual, vision, goals, pre-week planning, and then bringing that together in the team format of the weekly alignment meeting. And so that's how we do approach it.
Yeah, that's great. Now, you talked a lot about pre-planning throughout our conversation, and people might be listening like, oh, what's so important about pre-week planning? Well, let's make it real. I love quotes. As I said before, here's a passage that I just think it illustrates it perfectly. And this goes back to your pilot days. Imagine what would happen if a pilot said, we don't need to do a pre-flight planning. We're just going to wing it. That would result in chaos, frustration, misalignment, and confusion. Not good, end quote. So make this real. How does this pre-planning help not only pilots in a flight get through their flight, but help our own productivity by doing the pre-planning? And feel free to share whatever you want on that.
Yeah. So for all of us, if you're listening to this, I would ask you, what are the things that are really important to you? And I'm guessing that most of us would answer with similar answers. I want to feel peace. I want to have some level of fulfillment. I want to have healthy relationships. I want to be in a good place physically and mentally. So we share similar focuses. But once again, I think this is the third time we've talked about it. How do we get there? And that's the gap that most people are experiencing. So yeah, let's use the pilot analogy. I flew F-16s. What would happen if I was to jump in the F-16 and say, you know what, we're not doing pre-flight planning today. We're just going to wing it.
Sounds like chaos.
It absolutely would be chaos. Good chance some of us would die. So it'd be chaos. It'd be confusion. Well, how many of us go into our weeks without a plan and expect a different result? So a pilot, in my case, I would never dare jump in the F-16 without doing pre-flight planning. How much more successful will we be going into our weeks if we've taken 20 to 30 minutes to do pre-week planning? And when I say pre-week planning, I'm really talking about how we outline it in the book. Because most of us think pre-week planning, I'm just going to go through my work role. I'm going to figure out, here's what I need to do and my priorities. And while that's a good start, in the spirit of the quote that you already used, good, better, best, there is a much better way to do pre-week planning. And I'll just take one example, the CEO of Cliff Bar, an amazing lady. She said, here I am in my late 40s. I've got older children. I can't imagine what my life would have been like had I learned this in my 20s. And she shared a comment that most people share, and that is what I already mentioned. Most of us, when we talk about pre-week planning, are used to looking at our work role, our professional role, and we go through the calendar and say, what do I need to do next week? And that's the extent of pre-week planning. We share a whole different approach, and there are 4 steps that we use as part of that that really are critical. Simple, yet really powerful.
For people who had never done the pre-week planning before, and then you got them through the framework of doing this, what kind of things do they say to you afterwards? I know you're going to probably say it's life-changing, but make it real. Like what kind of benefits are they receiving from actually doing it? And maybe once they get a few weeks under their belt.
Yeah. And I don't want to sound overly cliche by saying life-changing, but I'm not sure what other words to use because that is the most common statement. Let me give you a real example. And this is repeated literally hundreds of times, if not thousands, just with slight variations on the wording. So I was at Lackland Air Force Base. We were doing a training for a group of what's called combat controllers and pararescue. These are the guys and gals that would come and get you if you have to eject behind enemy lines. Usually they would be embedded with some Navy SEALs and vice versa. This is your elite of the elite. We went through, everyone developed their vision for each role, same thing with their goals for the year. You could already feel that. People were excited. There was a palpable energy in the room. And then when we got to pre-week planning, we spent about an hour on this particular habit of pre-week planning and the 4 steps, how do you do it? And then we had them do their pre-week planning for the upcoming week. Well, one of these gentlemen who was a combat controller, had been in the Air Force for about 17 years, he had thought a lot about his husband role. He came up with a vision of his role of husband. He had come up with some goals for the year. And when he got to pre-week planning, he had his roles listed out. And then he was going through saying what matters most in each role this week. So it's far more than just our professional role because we're a composite of all of them, right? It's not just one role. He put on his pre-week planning under the role of husband, schedule a date night with, his wife, fill in the blank, her name. And then step 4 in the process is to assign a time for each action item. So I asked him, when are you going to do that? And he said, well, I'll do it here. And he put a time in and he put it in there. And then I asked him, well, why is this a big deal to you? Or, why a date night? And he got kind of quiet. And he just whispered to me and he said, Rob, I can't remember the last time I went on a date with my wife. I go, what? And I said, do you mind telling me a little bit more? He said, yeah, we've been hovering on the verge of a divorce for a while. And his whole point was, I'm realizing today during this training that I've neglected this entire role for who knows how many years. And it's time for me to take ownership and start doing something about it. Loved what he said. He is exactly right. So imagine the alternative scenario in his case. Or here's another real world example. Executive team at Pepsi. One of these executives, young 60s, in the role of father. And notice I'm using outside of work examples because these are the ones that we're not quite as used to. Under the role of father, he wrote, call my son. And when the trainer, and it wasn't me, we have other trainers, the trainer asked him and said, well, why call my son out of curiosity? And his response was because 7 years ago, he and his son had gotten into an argument and they hadn't talked since. Yeah, it's like, yikes. Okay, that's a big deal. And so the trainer asked him, when will you do it? Step 4. And he said, Thursday, 7:00 p.m. So great. 6 months later, they had a follow-up training to come back and see how it's going with pre-week planning, et cetera. And this same trainer saw this executive and, looked at him and just a total difference in energy. You could see just a difference in the way he was standing there. So they had a conversation and he asked him, well, did you call your son? And he said, let me tell you what happened. For years, he said, I've been procrastinating that call. It goes back to the 800 to 1,000 additional priorities. That was just one, a phone call, just one. But he'd been procrastinating it for 7 years, like many of us have done with other aspects of our lives. Yet he said, I had it in my planner, I had done it, and I knew I needed to make the call. So he did. He picked up the phone. And as soon as they started talking, he went on to share that they couldn't even remember what they had argued about 7 years prior. And now they've started talking every week and they've become best friends.
Oh, I love that.
He went on to share with the trainer one more thing. He said, I found out on that initial call that I had 2 grandchildren who I didn't even know existed.
That's crazy.
And so he said, I added the role of grandfather. And that's just 2 examples of pre-week planning of how something so simple can be so powerful. So how do we not use the word life-changing?
No, that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing those examples. Those are very powerful. You made it real for sure. In the book, you emphasize about making every day count. And I love this because most people start their day like staring at email or letting the day happen to them. And you outlined some really cool morning routine habits that would help get us on track. What are some of those that might supercharge our productivity?
This is a good one. And this is probably a good time to remind us that we're not trying to be machines and that we need to have grace with ourselves in this journey that we've been talking about. And so, yeah, as we do pre-week planning and we develop these visions for each roles and goals, we're not becoming robots, but rather we're becoming the better and best version of ourselves. And that's what we're working towards on the journey. Maybe there's a day or 2 or even a week or 2 where we take a step backwards. It's okay. It's all right. And so I just don't want us to sound like we're over-programmed. There is still a lot of room in our weeks for flexibility. And this morning routine is a good example of that. You know what? Maybe there's a morning where we don't do anything. Okay, that's all right. The next day, let's pick back up. None of us are perfect. But there are certain things that we can do in the morning that will really set us up for success throughout the day. And I realize that there's different times where there's different seasons. As a fighter pilot, there was times where I had to show up at 4:30 in the morning. I'm not going to have a power hour at 3:30 in the morning. So I get there's different seasons. And I'll keep this answer short. Some people call it the power hour. You can call it whatever you want. And whether it's a 15 minutes or 30 minutes or it's a true hour, the point is taking just a few minutes in the morning for that personal role. So rather than rolling out of bed, checking email, the news, and immediately inundating ourselves with all these quadrant 1 things that are going to cause stress, we take just a few minutes to focus on ourselves and get off to a good start. So whether that's through meditation or yoga or prayer or scripture study or exercise, drinking 16 ounces of water to get the body rehydrated, whatever these things are, it's just getting the day off on the right foot and setting a tone for the day. Is it going to be more likely to happen if we think about it and do pre-week planning? Absolutely, it will. But I want to make sure that I have clearly conveyed that we don't need to expect perfection out of ourselves. We've also got to allow for grace, because we're not machines. And if we miss a day or 2, it's okay.
Yep.
Pick right back up. And that's the spirit of good, better, best.
Yeah. Good segue into one of my final questions for you is just about sustaining this. And I know a lot of people, they set these New Year's resolutions, they go strong for a month, not sustainable, completely falls off. How have you seen people use your framework to build that momentum and make sure it's really ingrained in their everyday habits, their every week habits, and for the longevity?
Brandon, that is an excellent question. It probably is the number one question that organizations ask. because they've been through so many. And so have everybody. I mean, think about, if you're listening to this, how many trainings have you been through, quote unquote, in your life? And that's one of the biggest tricks, right? Is how do we sustain whatever it is, fill in the blank. So in this case, pre-week planning and do what matters most. How do we sustain this over the course of time? Here are a few ways to do it. And this is what we'll invite you to do in the book. If you were to sit through one of our trainings, you would do all of this. So number one, let me take one more step back to answer this. If you would like to get a program that you can use, in other words, either a paper planner, or we've developed an extension or downloadable file that you can use on either the Google Calendar or Outlook Calendar. In the book, there's a QR code where you can scan it. It will take you right to the website and you can get that. Or you can go to dowhatmattersmostplanner.com. So number one is having the right tools. If you're trying to do this on your own piece of paper, you can do that, but your odds of sustaining it, to your point, over time are not high. Usually people have the right tools. You know, it's like a carpenter. If you're going to be a carpenter, you've got to have the right tools. And that's the case with this. So we've developed a planner people can use, or you can custom design your own on our website from scratch, or you can use the extension on Google Outlook. The bottom line is there's a tool for whatever it is that you want to use. Using the right tool is a great start. So dowhatmattersmostplanner.com is number one. Number two, if you're using the right tool and you've gotten it from the website there, you will get an email every Sunday for a period of time. And then for months after that, you're going to get additional tips. Our purpose in doing that is touch points. Because what you're talking about, Brandon, is how do we develop the habit? And so we walk shoulder to shoulder. And the whole point is, how do we do this together? How do we develop these habits together? And touch points are the key. And so, you know, there's the email Sunday morning. Oh, that's right. Pre-week planning. Touch point. And the third touch point, and the final one I'll share right here, amongst there's others that we could do, but you know, people can read this in the book or find them on the site. The third one is to set an alarm or reminder in your phone. In other words, you plan a time to do pre-week planning. Now, I will say for most people, that's between Friday afternoon and Sunday evening. I used to say, I'll even back that up, Sunday afternoon. I used to say Sunday evening, but I don't say that anymore because it doesn't work. If a family event comes up or there's a big game on TV, pre-week planning is the first thing to go. So 20 to 30 minutes Sunday morning, Saturday morning, Friday after work, whenever, find 20 to 30 minutes, which equates to 0.03% of your week. And you're using that 0.03% of your week to determine what you do with the rest of the 99.7 to 9% of your week. It's a small ask for such a huge return. So scheduling a time that you can be consistent with is also a big deal, and putting it in your planner. Can I share one final comment on that, Brandon?
Of course, yeah.
We started by saying it's a mindset and a skill set, right? We talked a lot about mindset. Here's part two to the mindset. There is a big difference between saying, oh, I forgot to do my pre-week planning. Dang it. Okay, well, that's a mistake. No problem. Get back on the horse, right? But if our little alarm reminder goes off Sunday morning and we're just sitting there like, nah, I'm not going to do pre-week planning. That's a whole different thing. We're choosing not to do something then versus I just forgot. You know, that's a mistake. So the more touch points we can have, as long as we have the desire and the willingness, those touch points are key. We have the right tool, first of all. So either the extension on Google or Outlook, or the paper planner or the custom planner that you design. Second, if you want to get on our email list, you can through those same sites. We'll walk shoulder to shoulder with you. And third is schedule a time to do it and be consistent with that time and make it a habit. That's why we call them habits. But we also need to have grace in the journey and not expect perfection from ourselves. It's okay to miss a week now and then. Just don't let that become the norm.
Yeah. Well said, Rob. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. This has been so much fun. If you could leave people with something or a way to connect with you or an action item, what might that be?
Yeah, again, I try to avoid sounding cliche, but you know, we've been talking this whole time about Do What Matters Most. I invite you to download and read the second edition of Do What Matters Most, and make sure it's the second edition, because on Audible, they still haven't removed the first edition, at least as of today. Oh. And so get the second edition. We've made 40% changes to that from the first edition.
Wow.
Read it or listen to it all the way through. Like, you've got to make it through the pre-week planning chapters. That's what it's all about, as you've heard today on the podcast. That is such a simple starting point. Either read or listen to the book. Number two, go to Do What Matters Most Planner and get either the extension or a physical planner or a custom planner so that you have the right tool while you're reading the book. And then, this is easy, test it for 4 weeks. In other words, while you're reading the book, finish your vision, finish a draft of your goals for the year, and do pre-week planning for 4 weeks. And then you make the evaluation. And I'm confident you'll get to the point where you're saying, how did I live without this? This has been life-changing, just like it was for that combat controller, the Pepsi Executive Elite, and certainly it has been for me. I mean, I'm going on 27 years of doing this, and I can't imagine not doing it at this point.
My guest today has been Rob Shallenberger, the author of Do What Matters Most. Rob, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Brandon. Have a great day.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.